BBC Two Southern Eye. 50 years on from victory in Europe, Robert Powell salutes the people of Southampton.
In Southampton today, the Second World War is not just history. 1 in 5 lived the events which others can barely imagine. But as Britain prepares to celebrate victory in Europe 50 years on, Southern Eye examines a secret report that convinced the wartime government that Southampton was on the brink of collapse. It's a report which sits uneasily with tales of heroism and camaraderie as the heart of Southampton was bombed out of existence.
Speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Southampton had been preparing for war long before the Prime Minister's announcement. As the men joined the armed forces, women were needed in the factories. Overnight, life changed completely. Faced with the reality of war, people were thrown into jobs and a way of life they could never have imagined. At Marchwood Park, girls were trained to build boats.
When the war started, Scott Payne took over Marchwood Park, and they took on the girls for 8 weeks, I think, training.
We were trained at Marchwood, all aspects of building the boats. We were taught right from the start of what tools, how to use them. Somebody had to do it, and a lot of the lads were called up in the army, so somebody had to help out.
People on the home front were proud that the work they were doing was making a difference. The famous Spitfire fighter plane, designed and built in the town, became a powerful symbol of this achievement.
That first time Norman came into my life, it was one of those perfect June days. I was sat out in the backyard. I was on night shift at Pirelli's. My dad was too at the Supermarine. He had this new song about the Spitfire.
Music in the sky, don't you hear the engines humming? Prepare to do or die. The Hampshire planes are coming. Steadfast reliant, Spitfire or defiant. So give a rousing cheer. The Hampshire planes are here.
British fighters outperformed the German Air Force. The factories where Spitfires were made became key targets. In September 1940, bombers attacked the plants at Woolston and Itchen. The deaths of more than 50 workers would be devastating.
The first raid was on a Tuesday. They hadn't sounded the sirens, and many people didn't get out of the factory. If they had have sounded the sirens, I would have gone into my normal shelter, and unfortunately, for the people that did make it in the shelter were killed because they dropped the bombs on the shelters, missing the factory.
It was after the Tuesday when we had the one, then this one came on the Thursday. Well, when the alarm went, that was it, you know, we rushed out. I grabbed the bike, my push bike, and no one would use the shelters.
There was very little warning indeed. And we left the Itchen Works and ran up onto Peartree Green, and then the bombs really did come down there. The bomb doors opened, the little black things tumbled out, and the whistling noises, and the ground shook. Cartridge cases were hitting the road, we were being machine gunned as well. I hadn't any conscious feeling of being afraid. It was annoyance, it was irritation, it was and being unable to do anything about it.
Going down to the Itchen Works, looking up, there was no roof there hardly, just girders, and one of the propeller had gone up, and the tip was caught in the girders. It looked like a cross. So I always remember that, as if it was an omen of some sort.
Within 7 weeks, production was back on target in makeshift workshops. But for Southampton, the worst was to come. 2 months later, at the end of November 1940, the town became the first outside London to be bombarded 2 days running.
Only just sat down and had a sip of tea when the sirens went, and we were detailed to go out to incidents with another police officer called P.C. Hoare. And we walked out to above Bar Street. There were flares above and bombs dropping, and we shook hands on the junction of above Bar Street and Civic Centre, and I'm sure both of us thought we wouldn't see each other again. I continued on the edge of the parks, and I suppose I dived about 5 or 6 times between New Road and Hanover buildings, and while I was on the ground I did see incendiary bombs dropping quite near me and igniting.
One of these bombs came down through the roof at the back, straight through Mrs. Collins, who was the housekeeper, through her pillow. And her hair and nightdress were all on fire. She came out of the door screaming. And we had to keep the bath full of water. We had buckets of sand and water on the landing. And of course my father picked up a bucket of water to throw over Mrs. Collins just as the fireman had lifted the window. And of course it missed Mrs. Collins and hit the fireman straight in the face. He wasn't very pleased.
The bus driver said, "There's a raid on, jump on or I'm taking off." He took off, and we witnessed incendiary bombs coming down the high street in Southampton. When we got to the Common, a big gun on the Common fired, and the bus practically left the road. He then went scooting off up to Chilworth, and we stopped the bus, and everyone on the bus got out to look back on Southampton, which unfortunately was all ablaze at that particular time.
It was a fire blitz, and as we walked down the high street, all the buildings were going up in flames. It was sort of a miniature Dante's Inferno. There was fire everywhere.
A lot of my school friends that got killed in the art gallery. That was very tragic. That was in my school. I was at home, but because I was off sick. But then nearly the whole class were killed in the air raids, in that particular air raid on the art gallery and by the side of the Guildhall.
The first person I'd ever seen dead was a little girl of 3. She'd gone to bed, and she was in her nightie, and there wasn't a mark on her. She was killed by blast.
Going down Bernard Street with these other officers, we first saw a tram on fire outside the Glasgow Hotel, and then I was attracted by the sound of singing and music coming from a pub called the Duke opposite. On entering it, I found it was full of customers still drinking and singing their hearts away as well, with no possible worries of war at all. The landlord offered me refreshment, which I gladly accepted. So not said beer, have I?
The Blitz destroyed the heart of the town. Shops, factories and 14 churches were flattened. 214 men, women and children died. The king came to show his support, but in government circles there was real fear that Southampton was broken. 4 days after the bombings, a government inspector arrived. Wing Commander John Hodsall came to see how the air raid precautions had worked. His report suggested civilian morale had collapsed through lack of leadership.
There is no outstanding personality in the local Southampton government at all. The mayor is a poor creature, and as far as could be made out, disappeared about 3 o'clock every afternoon in order to get home in safety. The other councillors are none of them of such a calibre as could be put in charge, and the whole place is also apparently riddled with intrigue.
These people, after all, were human beings who were doing jobs for which not only had they not been trained, but nobody could ever have been trained because nobody knew what the job was going to be before the war came. At the outset of war, the assumption was that the big strain was going to be on hospital accommodation because there were going to be millions and millions of casualties almost instantly. So you had a huge reservoir of emergency hospital accommodation for the expected casualties, which did not materialise because bombs in Britain did not cause as many casualties as expected. The other post-raid facilities were, as it were, stunted and held back in favour of this medical provision, so that the rest centres in Southampton, as in other places, were not particularly well organised, and inevitably a lot of them got knocked out by the bombs anyway, so that a couple of days after the raids, a mass observer doing a report on the town can only find 2 of the 24 rest centres, which is where people are supposed to report after they've been made homeless.
What I do remember as reporters, that we did discover that after the Blitz, really there was a lack in organisation in Southampton. I think it was certainly true that people were left after the November 40 raids. A great many of the homeless were left without clothing, bedding, until a very freezing Christmas. And it was only when officials were sent from London to cut the red tape that they were able to supply clothing to a lot of people who hadn't got any, who lost everything in the raids, because there was nothing in the shops. The shops had lost their stocks. And really, not very much was done to provide any emergency supply of clothing. And the other thing that Southampton seemed to be lacking was any sort of communal feeding plan.
So far as could be ascertained, the Civil Defence Services had generally behaved extremely well under most trying circumstances. The civil machine, on the other hand, appeared to have come almost to a complete standstill.
All sorts of things went wrong under the pressure of the bombing, which couldn't entirely have been foreseen. There was a terrible shortage of dispatch riders, for instance. There was only one van to go around supplying information after the local newspaper had been knocked out, which meant that the newspaper couldn't be used as a source of information to people. And so, I mean, one has to have sympathy now with the poor bloody local government officials and elected members of local government who were being asked to perform way beyond anything that had been expected of them before. The most damaging stories in the Hodsall report, to my mind, are not about officials. They're about the first aid service, where it seems that after the third big raid, the first aid service was down to 25% of its strength. and about half its members had simply gone missing. A couple of doctors had gone missing, had simply deserted, as it were, in the face of the enemy. And there was a specific instance of 3 members of a first aid party who had refused to go out and were clearly hoping to get sacked, so Hodsall concluded, so that they could get another job up with better money. By that stage of the war, if you were in air raid precautions and similar, your wages compared very unfavourably with those that people were earning in war industry. And there was quite a lot of reasons why you might want to get out of the civil defence services.
The other thing was that Southampton shelters could have been better. The shelters in Southampton were really not adequate when one thinks of the years of bombing the town experienced. I mean, there was no doubt about it. People in Southampton used to say, "Oh, how we envy the Londoners with their tube stations." I mean, there was a feeling that the shelters were not adequate.
And then the planes were on top of us, a whole wave of them. The whole shelter was like vibrating with the noise of them. My mum was moving her lips. You could read her praying, saying the same words over and over again into herself. And then the bombs began to drop, at first away from us, and then closer. That's the church they've got! They've got the church! I know it, George, I know!
It's nowhere near the church. Take it easy,
Nothing
love.
is safe, even the house of God! What are we going to do, Helen? What are we going to do? Mum, it'll be all right. It'll be all right, Mum.
Most nights we slept in shelters for the simple reason you never knew when there was going to be a blitz. So rather than go to bed and be there for about 5 minutes and have to get up, we had our beds made in the shelters.
You could hear the dirt dropping down on top of our shelter. And Dad and I, we said to one another, well, that sounds a bit close, sounds could possibly be the house, you know. So I looked out of the shelter and the house was okay. And then after about 5-10 minutes we heard voices and went and had a look. And unfortunately there had been a direct hit on the shelter in the garden next to us, which was about, 30 feet away, that was all. And unfortunately the father, the mother and the 2 children were killed. And yet only a few feet away was the chicken run, and in there were all these chicken. There wasn't a feather off of them.
They've got the church, I know.
It's nowhere near the church. Take it easy, love. Something's a near one.
They've laid it flat. The whole church. Everything's destroyed. Father Kennelly's and all the other fathers.
Shall I go and see?
Stay here, for God's sake.
It's quietening down a bit.
There was one episode, I was stood at the back door here, and it was the time when the people came out of the aircraft factory, and a fighter plane came down from the road, and I could see the pilot in it, and it was firing at the people coming home from work.
Mostly it was a feeling of helplessness. There was, when the gun stopped firing and there wasn't a lot of ammunition left, the feeling was that, you know, there was nothing to hit back with, nobody was doing anything, you were being bombed, and really nobody was helping very much. And I think it was frustration, helplessness, combined with fear, because people were trekking then at the town in large numbers. A mere fraction of the people in Southampton were left at night.
After we'd had nights and nights of bombing in Southampton and not getting a lot of sleep, obviously they were bombing the town and not the country. So what we all decided to do, several roads, I mean we were mountains of us, we packed up our blankets and headed out for the country, which was out Rownham's way then, which is all built up now, of course. And we were quite sure then that we were going to have a few hours of even just sitting on the edge of the countryside and singing. And we would all march out, then we'd all march back again about 3 o'clock in the morning, when we were hoping all the bombing had finished.
It was reported that a number of people had left the town on previous nights and slept in the woods, but it was understood that this practice had now stopped and everything was being done to see that it did not recur.
What officials and others thought they were seeing was something like what had happened in France a bit earlier, when the German army had been advancing and French civilians fled in droves in front of the advancing German army, pushing their belongings in prams and carts and so on. So the word refugees was originally applied to the people who were later called trekkers. But as the dust, in a sense, literally settled, I think the opinion would form that trekking was no bad thing.
It meant that, thank goodness, they had common sense. They all started to evacuate about 3 o'clock in the afternoon to the surrounding villages outside Southampton in the New Forest, and they would return the next morning. And this, no doubt, is the reason why our casualties really was so low with the number of bombs that dropped.
The evidence was, from Britain and later from Germany, that people running away from bombs were often very good at running back. And in fact, if you look at the records in Southampton, you'll see that one thing which did go quite well after the raids, which the authorities did organise rather well, was emergency transport. The trams were running remarkably quickly, and transport was laid on to bring workers back from where they fled to. And so long as that was there, so long as the transport service could be sustained or improvised in some way, then you could still keep vital industries going. The work of Southampton docks, it seems, was not badly affected by this horrendous bombardment.
630 people died in 51 raids. The town was left in ruins, but people carried on. The Hartzell report remained secret. When it was released 30 years later, the city councillors insisted it was wrong. To this day, their rebuttal lies alongside Hartzell's account. Certainly, Southampton recovered to take centre stage in the D-Day landings. And as war in Europe came to a close, the role of those on the home front was properly acknowledged.
This is your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom is every day. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this.
I was singing at a concert in a SEAL camp. They called them SEAL camps because you were picked up in an army lorry and you didn't know where you were being taken. It was usually somewhere in the New Forest. And the concert started the same as any other concert, and I'd just finished my first number and I noticed this officer sort of hovering at the side of the stage. And he came on and said, could he make, he wanted to make an announcement, and the men all sort of groaned. And he said, oh, no, you'll like this one. And he said that they had just heard that the war in Europe had finished. And there was an instant's astonished silence, and then everybody went mad. Everybody sort of kissed everybody, slapped everybody on the back, jumped up and down, and generally went absolutely crazy.
We used to get bulletins put over the tannoy system, if anything. We'd won a bit of ground or something over in France and that. And when it was announced on the tannoy, everybody just cheered and threw their tools up the air and banged. And then I think we were sent home early.
That's what you say. Step aside, partner, it's my day. Bend an ear and listen to my version of a really solid Tennessee excursion. Pardon me, boy, is that cherry choo-choo? Would you give me a shot?
One of the nicest things I thought after 4 years of darkness was seeing all the lights again, the lights in the street, the lights in the shops and in the pubs and so on. And of course it was a proper cosmopolitan atmosphere because we had all sorts of foreign people here at that time, Free French, sailors, mostly free French sailors, Polish Air Force, the Dutch Army, the Americans, of course, and loads of our own people. So it was a really fantastic night, absolutely marvellous.
Absolutely marvellous, you know. We went with some friends of ours into Southampton, and people were singing, laughing, dancing, acting the fool, you know, and obviously overjoyed that it was all over.
When you're young, you don't feel so frightened. You're not aware of any. You're not aware of disaster to the extent you are when you're older. It was quite exciting, but you realize that people were dying, you know, being killed by these bombs and incendiary bombs and so on.
Be steady and realistic, don't anchor for gold or gems. Be carefree and realistic, like old Father Thames.
It wasn't until after the war, really, that you realise what you've been through. And I think a lot of people, including myself, I think we felt a lot more of the strain after the war than what you did while it was going on.
You didn't realise, because you were so young, it was tragic and sad and whatever. And it's only since the last 2 or 3 years I've really thought about how terrible, disastrous war is.
Nazi